Everyone, welcome to this next Connect session. I actually just finished it, went and I always look at it first before I post it and realized there was no volume, or no sound rather, because I have forgotten to connect my mic. So I just spent the last several minutes talking without any purpose. And so this may be a little shorter than the previous one. I wanted to talk today about hormonal control in the urinary system, and a large part of that is really the control, as we learned previously, of blood pressure, or ultimately we're talking about the control of water and the storage of water in our systems. I find that for me anyway, it's easy to remember because all of the hormones that we're going to talk about start with the letter A. Angiotensin 2, aldosterone, ADH, and ANP or ANH, depending on your references. On the other hand, that may make it a little more difficult because they do all start with A. But at the very least, as you're in the exam or whatever, you can just think, okay, A, and then try to distinguish between the different ones. So we're going to go through this again. Sorry, I just am floored that I went through all that without having my mic on. So let's talk a little bit in review, because we have talked about this system before, what happens, and maybe talk about it in a little more detail now that we have an understanding of the urinary system and how it functions with reabsorption and secretion and so forth. So in the presence, or I should say in the absence, of blood pressure in the renal arterioles here, as they come into the kidney, renin is released when there's a lower blood pressure. It is a sensitive to the pressure. And when it is released, renin is an enzyme, remember, not a hormone, just an enzyme. It will take angiotensinogen, which is a plasma protein. It's floating or traveling through the blood, and it will convert it to angiotensin 1, or will help stimulate that conversion to angiotensin 1, which is a very weak vasoconstrictor. And as angiotensin 1, which once again we're still in the blood here, goes through the lungs, then the converting enzyme, ACE, then will convert angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. Now, angiotensin 2 is a very strong, powerful hormone. It does a lot of things for us. Hormone, which we'll learn in a couple of modules. In Module 9, we'll learn that a hormone is a substance that has an effect on other substances, usually, receptors, cells, that type of thing. But it has to travel through the blood, and that its origin is different than its location, its site of action. Those are some of the terms we use when we discuss hormones. But this angiotensin 2, once again, is a strong vasoconstrictor. So just by virtue in of itself of vasoconstricting, we're going to increase blood pressure. If you recall from the blood pressure module, that when we decrease the radius, we increase the resistance, or the force that opposes flow, and in doing so, we increase blood pressure within the vessel. And so that's one way it helps us control pressure. And another way, it actually stimulates and increases the sympathetic activity, which you should have learned from 264 and 265. Sympathetic activity is that action mode where your body's going to go into some type of action. It's typically known with a cliche of fight or flight. But I like to think of it more as an action verb, something you do to either run away or to stand and defend yourself or something like that. You're going to see an increase in blood pressure because of that as well. So in addition to that, angiotensin 2 also helps with sodium reabsorption. And if you remember, I've said it in the last Connect session, and I've said it before in other systems, where sodium goes, water follows. And so this is a way to retain more water, is by increasing our sodium and chloride reabsorption. In addition to stimulating this process directly, angiotensin also stimulates from the adrenal gland, which sits on top of the kidney, aldosterone, which aldosterone has a specific effect to increase sodium reabsorption and water retention. And finally, in addition to that, angiotensin also has a direct stimulation of ADH. Now, ADH is a special type of hormone. It is produced in the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior pituitary. There are two of those that we'll learn about once again in Module 9. This particular one is called antidiuretic hormone, ADH, and it causes the direct reabsorption of water at the collecting duct as well as the distal convoluted tubule, and that's the same with aldosterone, even though this is kind of focusing on collecting duct. We do see it in the distal convoluted tubule as well, and I'll show you a picture a little bit later of that. So this is all in response to, once again, a low blood pressure in the arterioles in the kidney. And once again, renin does that. It starts the whole process and the whole cascade. Now, ADH can also be stimulated directly by osmoreceptors. If there is a small change in the osmolarity, references I've read in the past say as small as 2 milliosmol, so not a lot of change there. But what happens is once that is detected in the hypothalamus where ADH is made, it does stimulate the release of ADH secretion directly, which then can increase water absorption and get blood pressure higher because we're increasing that water. The water is reabsorbed into the blood and we get a higher blood volume. Aldosterone also has a separate stimulation besides angiotensin II. Because it's part of the adrenal gland in the cortex, it is sensitive to another pituitary hormone called ACTH, which is adrenal corticotropic hormone, which we'll learn about in 2 modules, in module 9 and in the endocrine system. But ACTH stimulates all the cortex. It doesn't really distinguish between the different types of hormones. And just a little FYI, there's probably over 30 hormones in the cortex. We divide it into 3 classes, and we talk about the main one in each class, and we'll do that later. But suffice it to say, if ACTH is released, oh, sorry, I wanted to pause. Sorry about that. That was weird. All right, so where was I? Oh, aldosterone. So if ACTH is stimulated, and one of the ways ACTH can be stimulated is stress, for example. Increased stress, we see an increased release of adrenal gland hormones, and part of that is aldosterone. And aldosterone will then increase sodium and increase water retention, so we'll see increased blood pressure. Okay, so these 3 all contribute, angiotensin II, aldosterone, and ADH, to helping us absorb or reabsorb or retain water in our system. Now, what happens if we have the opposite effect, where we have too much blood volume? Then we hear of the hormone, which isn't really listed here, of ANH or ANP, which is atria natriuretic peptide. And in that case, what happens is the stretching of the atria, hence atria natriuretic hormone or peptide. The stretching of the atria stimulates the release of ANH or ANP, and it just depends on your reference. ANP is a peptide, so it's a protein hormone. And many people use that convention still. I think it's ANH you'll see in the newer references because it's considered an official hormone, so it has the name hormone instead of peptide. Anyway, semantics really. But what happens then is as ANP is released, we see a decrease of sodium reabsorption instead of an increase, and we see an inhibition of ADH. I'm going to share a quick diagram with you that kind of shows that I shared a previous one here. So just kind of showing you once again that we have the effects of aldosterone in the distal convoluted tubule and in the collecting duct, as well as ADH here and here. ANP shows it's inhibitory here, so it's not allowing sodium to be absorbed, so more water is excreted and more sodium is excreted in response to ANP, which is once again stretching the atria because the blood volume is normal, larger than normal. And so you'll see that kind of as a counterbalance to saving all the water. Now, as we talked about in the previous Connect session with absorption and secretion, it's this area here, the distal convoluted tubule, and the collecting duct that's really variable on whether or not water is impermeable. We say under normal circumstances, water is impermeable here, but in the presence of hormones, it can be variable. It can actually be reabsorbed. And so that's all dependent upon circumstances, and that's how we kind of control urine output, is what hormones are being released, what's our blood pressure like, that type of thing. One thing I will tell you, in the absence of ADH, just to give you an idea, Once again, remember that's the one that can be directly stimulated by just a small change in osmolarity or be stimulated by angiotensin II, which is stimulated by a decrease here in blood volume, so decreased pressure here, which translates to a decreased volume. But without any ADH, we have a condition called diabetes insipidus, and I mentioned this also in the last connection session, that without ADH, the person doesn't reabsorb water, so they are constantly urinating. Usually within every 20 minutes, they're just losing water like crazy because they don't have this. And so we know that ADH is pretty prevalent since we normally don't have to do that. But so just the idea that the hormones are constantly being released and inhibited based on current circumstances. It's not like all of a sudden you're very dehydrated and then it happens. No, it happens very quickly. In fact, before you would even think of being thirsty, if you're dehydrated enough just a little, then ADH is functioning. Individuals with diabetes insipidus, so an excess loss of water, have to take medication to try to combat that, to try to have more of an antidiuretic effect, and they would have medication that would help them do that. As you read probably in the reading material, a diuretic is something that helps us lose water. And just as a little hint towards before we get into acid-base balance and disorders there, some people who know they're going into high altitudes, and one of the effects of high altitude sickness, or I should say one of the, what happens when someone gets high altitude is they have a tendency to start retaining water. And one of the dangerous things about that is pulmonary or cerebral edema. In other words, water starts accumulating in the lungs or in the brain cavity. And so some individuals do, as a precautionary or as a preparatory method, take diuretics before they go, a few weeks before they go. So they're essentially kind of dehydrating their body, excuse me, so that when they start in those high altitudes and they start to retain excess water due to the high altitudes and the lower levels of oxygen, it doesn't really cause the edema. It's just going back to more of a natural state. So they delay the sickness a little bit by doing that. It's not something that's often recommended, but I know that doctors have suggested that before for individuals that are going for a while into a high altitude from a normal altitude. So just kind of a little FYI there on some pathophysiology. All right, last thing I was going to show is this. This is just a figure we've given you just to explain the osmoreceptors that are in the hypothalamus. And so, as you know, and we talked about this also again last Connect session, osmosis is a movement from a low concentration of solute to a high concentration of solute. And so when you have a low concentration of solute comparatively, you're going to see water move from low to high. If you have an increased solute concentration then in the area, interstitial fluid in this area, then the water is going to go from low to high, which is going to cause this to shrink in size and to lose water, and then that changes, it increases the firing rate of the axon, which then says, okay, we got to do something about that. We've got to retain more water, and that's when ADH is released. All right, so this is important for your next exam. You're going to have several questions about this control in the urinary system, and it's also on your comprehensive final. So I hope you'll take the time to review those and know their names and what specific effects they have and where they have those effects.